Morning.
And we're live. It is Thursday. It is May 15th. It is the year of our Lord 2025. And this is the first day of the new regime. I do have something to say about May 15th. May 15th is Vishivanka Day. And I know what you're wondering. You're wondering, what is Vishivanka Day? And Vishivanka Day, it just is. It's the day that Ukrainians put on Vishivankas. And how it became Vishivanka Day, I don't really know. It's kind of become a big deal. It's a thing. And Cleo, the dog, is very mad at me today because I'm not wearing a dog shirt, and she finds this outrageous. But it's Vishivanka Day. Now, I know what you're wondering. You're wondering, Ben, don't you have a dog Vishivanka? And the answer is no, I don't. I have worked and worked to acquire a dog Vishivanka. There is a Vishivanka that I'm thinking of acquiring that has, among many other cool weapon systems, HIMARS and whatever, it has the dog Patron, who sniffs mines. He's kind of a famous Ukrainian dog who demines fields. But right now, but it's not really a dog Vishivanka. It's like a cool Ukrainian army weapons systems Vishivanka, one of which weapons is a dog. What the Vishivanka I want is all dog, and I will try to have that for you by next year's Vishivanka Day. I do not have it this year. Look, it is very rare that I have to start the show with an apology. But I am going to start this show with an apology because, there's really two people that I owe apologies to here. The first is our guest.
And you can't give an apology, so you stop the show?
Yeah, so this is this is what happened. I was minding my own business, giving an apology, and a malevolent force took over my hand and took it over the stop button on the screen, and I actually accidentally stopped recording. But anyway, as I was saying, I a couple weeks ago had to cancel the show. As many of you remember, I went to California. It was going to be 5 a.m, and I I canceled the show. I told the audience I was canceling the show. I wrote it in the newsletter, but there were these two people that I didn't bother to tell. One of them is our guest, John Pollack, who dutifully showed up. And the other is Alicia Wanless, my esteemed, estimable co-host, who also showed up. And so we had everything necessary for a show except me to press the start button. John has, and one additional note, this was not a hard one to remember in the sense, some days it's tricky, but Alicia, because I'm not the most organized person in the world. And we run a show here where, we don't really have staff. We just kind of do whatever we do. And so sometimes you can forget that somebody's coming on. But then Alicia solved this problem. She created a shared Google Doc spreadsheet with all the schedule and the guests. And so all you really have to do before you cancel the show to know if you're, have to notify a guest and a co-host, all you really have to do is pull up a Google Doc. And I didn't do that. And so this was really doubly disgraceful and disrespectful to Alicia's hard work in creating an organizing framework. So I just want to start by apologizing to our guest and to my very esteemed co host. Um, and on this Vishivanka Day, I would like to humble myself before the world and acknowledge failure. That said, look, I was going to say the sun is shining, except that it's not. It's
I'm
cloudy
here.
and yeah, it's pretty grim. But the birds are chirping. It is going to be a great fucking day. And you are watching Dog Shirt TV, which is a goddamn revolution in morning television. And one of the revolutionary features, of which there are many, is that when it's Vishivanka Day, I wear a Vishivanka. Now, you go to Fox and Friends, you're not going to see a single Vishivanka on Fox and Friends. You go to the CBC, there are not going to be any Vishivankas, even though Canada is full of Ukrainian
Might
emigres.
be. You don't
They're
know that.
not going to be. Come on, are there going to be Vishivankas on the CBC today? On their morning show? You go to Joe and Mika, not gonna have a Vishivanka. But you come to Dog Shirt TV, where dog shirts are part of the branding of the show, and we are observing Vishivanka Day, a second one of the revolutionary features of the show. And as I say, there are many of them. Is that when we do a scheduling screw up, we do a flamboyant apology at the top of the show. It's none of this, namby-pamby correction,
or
low down.
Vishivashiness.
Yeah, no vishy-vashiness. Um, uh,
Oh,
that was
that is
bad. Um,
that's the time.
that is the subject of the day. All of which is a very long way of saying that we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have John Pollack join us at last on Vishivanka Day for a discussion of puns. Alicia, why don't you introduce our guest?
I mean, I would love to say first how you try to dictate my fashion choice and that this was the compromise shirt. I do own a Vyshyvanka, but I prefer this shirt from Lviv to represent Ukraine. John, I wanted to wear this. This is what I had on for you. I don't know if we can see that.
I love it.
Something beginning with what?
It says,
Oh,
I spy with my little eye something beginning with A, which is, great because I like to buy shirts that start with A, but also it's, an arrow in his eye.
but I want to ask.
Wordplay.
I understand. But I want to ask Alicia.
That's
How
from
does
the
wearing?
Bayou Tapestry, isn't it?
But I want to ask, how is my observance of Vishivanka Day, you're dictating you're wearing a non-Vishivanka?
I got a text message this morning asking if I had one and that I should put it on.
Yeah, but then you put on something other than a Vishivanka. It seems like,
Oh, I don't listen very well. I mean, especially when the orders are coming from the South. I mean, it's just not really something we want to do these days. And this suits me. It's red, it's black, it's within the fashion choice of what I would normally choose. The Shivanka I have is white.
okay, I just want to say, guys, Alicia sent me a text today in Swedish.
It's true.
And Um, I don't speak Swedish. And yet I understood the text. Um, and I'm proud of that I just handled myself with aplomb even when receiving texts in
That's
Swedish.
because you
Well,
were
we have no problem.
Bjorn with talent.
I was born with talent. You're good at
Hold
this.
on. John, we're going to introduce you now because when we first set this show up, you were like, I'm not coming on to deliver puns. And we're going to talk about the history of puns and your books and wordplay. And you have instigated the punniness this morning.
Well, just to loosen up, limber up a little bit.
Okay, so John has written several books, two of which are on wordplay, essentially. I shared the link in there. One is called Shortcut, How Analogies Reveal Connections, Spark Innovation, and Sell Our Greatest Ideas. And the other one is called The Pun Also Rises. And both are delightful reads. And John is here today to talk about the history of these things, people's relationship with wordplay, why some of these fell out of fashion. John, please welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, how do we know? I mean, the history of puns, wordplay is as old as language. How do we think about where that story starts?
Well, it starts way, way, way back before there was even written language. And the earliest evidence we have of the human, not just capacity for punning, but actual puns dates back 35,000 years. And there are these, it's a stone statuette from a cave somewhere in Eastern Europe. And on one, if you look at one side, it's a naked woman. And if you look at the other, and rotated 180 degrees, it's a phallus. And so what that shows is
proving that the subject matter of wordplay has not changed either.
Well, it was a double entendre, and it showed that people had the capacity to see two related ideas united in one. It just depended on how you looked at it, literally how you looked at it.
And it's always the same two related ideas.
Yes, it does. It does drive the propagation of the species.
That's interesting. So, but that's not wordplay so much as visual. I mean, because that's predating written language, right? So you're actually combining a wordplay with a kind of pictographic. I don't know what you call a visual pun.
Well, you call it a visual pun, and so puns come in many different forms, and there are spoken puns, which are a certain type, and they come in many varieties. And then there are ones written down, which lose some of their punch because when you and this was actually a result of the rise of the printing press, which started to hurt puns, because you had to when you write something down, you have to choose a spelling, and you automatically lose some of the ambiguity that is the coil, the spring of any good pun. But if you look back, let's go back in history to, some of the earliest written languages where you have cuneiform script in ancient Babylonia, and you had the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and those started out as literal, originated as literal pictures of something that meant something. But if you start to think about it, that's very limiting, because how do you convey time? How do you convey relational words? How do you convey the subjunctive? Pictures don't really allow you to do that very effectively. And what punsters did, and punning was very common in these pictograms. And in fact, if you look at the Rosetta Stone, there's in the Demotic Egyptian in there, there's a picture of a snake coming out of a hole. And if you look at the translation to the Greek, it translates as "go forth." And so you see some early efforts to abstract the meanings of these pictures. And what's really interesting is that, I'll ask you a question. What is the single, and we'll ask the audience, what is the single, one of the greatest breakthroughs intellectually that allowed the rise of modern civilization? And the answer is the phonetic alphabet, because the phonetic alphabet, for the first time in human history, allowed you to transmit detailed information over distance and time, because you could combine these letters into any combination, and you weren't limited to these clunky pictograms. But how did we go? And that happened about that. The first phonetic alphabet was the North Semitic alphabet that came into being in the Sinai Desert, or what is today Israel. around 1700 BC. And how did these scribes come up with this? They did it by.
And these were Nabateans, or I mean, it's pre-Phoenician, right?
Yeah, because Phoenician came out of this. So Phoenician is one of the alphabets that took advantage of this. The exact people who did it are lost to history, but this North Semitic alphabet was the result of breaking apart finally sound, symbol, and meaning. So they took these pictograms and they became increasingly abstracted and lost all their meaning except sound. And then that let you. They North Semitic had, I think, 30 letters in it, and then that gave rise to Phoenician, Greek, English, ultimately Sanskrit, and things got fiddled with along the way. Charlemagne added a few letters. I think it was U was one of the letters that he added, and the Greeks added vowels, and that's how we got to this the modern alphabet, and which alphabet is alpha and beta. It's a meld pun of the two,
which are in turn from aleph and bet.
Yes, yeah.
I forget what it is in Phoenician, but the idea that the first four letters of the alphabet are vowel, alpha, E, G, D, G morphing in to C in the Roman is consistent from Phoenician to Hebrew to Greek to us.
I did not know that, and that is really interesting. And
Hebrew, it's aleph, bet, gimel, daled, alpha, beta, gamma, delta.
In Russian.
It's the same. It's the same in the Cyrillic alphabet.
Yeah, because that descends from North Semitic as well. And
right.
And it's just so interesting when a practical tool comes into use, how quickly it spreads. And this was such a practical tool, and it both kind of propagated and was propagated by trade. So the Phoenicians carried it everywhere because they could record contracts, they could do bills of lading, they could. It was a great facilitator of commerce, and of course, commerce spreads ideas, and so this idea took root and spread, around the world.
So, what is the oldest written pun that you're aware of?
There are. I don't know if this is the oldest, but if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's full of puns, and so in ancient Sumeria and ancient Babylon, Akkadian, all those ancient languages were rife with puns, and this is an important thing to remember, is that in those days, now we associate puns, or many people associate puns with ha ha, like a bad joke, but really puns are just about conveying an efficient way of conveying multiple meanings through one expression. And so in those ancient times, it was more aha, not ha ha. And so it was a tool of a way to convey mystery, more than one meaning, because there was a lot of divination of signs in those days, and language was one means of expressing that. So if you look at the punning that went on there, it's all carved into stone or pressed into clay tablets. And when I was researching the Pun Also Rises, I went to London and talked with one of the top Egyptian curators in the world at the British Museum, and he said, well, of course, the pyramid texts are full of puns. And he said that some of the puns they could interpret and understand, and some of them were lost to history because the subtlety, had the knowledge to interpret that subtlety was, has just been lost over time. There's something called, there's a whole text that's in crocodile glyphs doing yoga and the crocodiles are contorting themselves, and they just don't know what it means.
That's so interesting. So what should we do with, one of the things, and our frequent co-host Holly and I have talked about the first passage of Genesis in the context of her fascination with Christian fundamentalism, the movement that she grew up. And my point about it is you can't read it literally in Hebrew. It's actually, because the individual words have multiple meanings, and when you translate them, you choose one meaning.
Yes.
So, for example, in the first reference to God in the first sentence in the beginning, which is itself translatable in a lot of different ways, God created the heavens and the earth, and the name the text uses for God is actually a plural. Um, and we traditionally regard that name as, which is Elohim, as referring to one God, but the literal grammatical meaning of Elohim is gods. Um, and um, and then you go on to the next sentence, and the world was formed of nothingness, right? The world was and the Hebrew for that is this famous phrase that nobody uses in English, but is used to this day in modern Hebrew to mean a mess, which is tohu vavohu, and it is kind of untranslatable, but it's the same word twice. It's sort of like nothingness of nothingness, and the text does this a lot. Use the same word twice in a row to convey emphasis. So nothingness of nothingness, or they'll say there's a famous phrase in God's of the God and the Egyptians saw the oppression with which the Egyptians were oppressing them, right? The use of the same word in different forms right in the same space. And this always comes out sounding very awkward in English because you're not supposed to use the same word over and over again. Vary the sound, right? They teach you in grade school. But in biblical Hebrew, it's the norm of the way to write things.
And in fact, if you look at the book of Job, it's full of what are called Janus parallels. And that's where a word is used in such a way as that it says one thing about the line that came before, and it presages in a different sense the line to come. And so this layering of meaning is the essence of punning, and it's just a modern misconception again that punning is stupid, because it's not. It's anything but. Are there good puns and bad puns? Absolutely. As I like to tell my kids, it's a volume business.
So help me out here. What is the difference between punning and all other wordplay?
Well, punning is a subset of wordplay, and I would say that get smart people in a room and they'll disagree where those borders are. The puns jump the fence, and this is the beautiful thing about language generally, but punning specifically, is that you can. And this is really relevant in the age of kind of the rise of autocracy. You can control what people say to a certain extent, but you can't control what people mean. And if you look at Orwell's 1984, there's an appendix, and he talks about the development of newspeak, and he says it'll be ready by, I think, 2050. It's coming out soon, and that it will eliminate double meanings essentially, and therefore you can't even think an errant thought. And then they'll do away with all the primary texts at that point. And if you look at China, if you, for example, or you look at societies that have greater repression, there's more punning because people have to be able to disguise what they're saying. And this is, again, not about ha-ha, it's about aha.
Does the simplification of language actually work in reducing the capacity to do that? So Chinese famously went through this communist-led simplification of the written language, reduction of the number of characters from some gigantic number to a much more manageable number. And, part of the criticism of that was that it actually, limited, that it had a sort of newspeak quality, right? Now, I don't evaluate that because I don't know standard Chinese writing, and so I'm not in a position to evaluate it. But is your impression that language simplification tends to have that effect that Orwell describes, or is it, people are really creative and they'll figure out within the parameters of any linguistic system how to say what they want?
Well, having had one semester of night school Mandarin, I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that the four tones ma 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 that is the only way to kind of layer on meaning from or to help people understand a symbol, a character, and otherwise, if you didn't have the four tones, that it would be very confusing what you were reading or excuse me, what you were hearing. There's obviously a great deal of censorship still in China, and there's something called the Ballad of the Grass Mud Horse. This was maybe 15 years ago, but it's still on YouTube, and it is ostensibly about a mythical, creature, but the phonetics, if you say it quickly, sounds like "fuck your mother." And
Yes. See, yes, I was going to say this. That's my problem with tonal languages. I would say something like, your mother's a good ride in Chinese, and mean, the car or the horse.
yeah, and so I think that the fact that there are so many censors working so hard suggests that they're having a hard time. That you can control, again, what people can say, but not what they can mean. And the language is too slippery to control. It just will morph. Language is always changing. And I guess this is one of the biggest things that I learned in researching my books on language, is just how constant the change is, how arbitrary meaning is. And that we, if you try and freeze language like
French,
or dictionary writers, or people trying to say this is what it means and it doesn't mean anything else. I mean, I think that I can't remember which Supreme Court justice who foolishly said some years ago, words can only have one meaning. It can't mean two. And I was like, what are you talking about? And because there are lots of words that have more than one meaning. It all depends on context. And so the answer is no. You cannot simplify language and control people's thoughts. I mean, you can.
In other words, Orwell was wrong.
Orwell was not wrong about the intent of autocrats, but Orwell was wrong about the ability to handcuff language, because you're just not going to succeed.
So, Alicia, I just want to say, in response to your fear of tonal languages, I'm a mother pheasant plucker. I pluck mother pheasants. I'm the most pleasant mother pheasant plucker who ever plucked a mother pheasant.
Was impressive. But you see, I've had an episode in a country where the language is tonal, and I've said the wrong thing out in public, and got scolded heavily by older men driving by on bicycles. That's enough for me to not try again.
I understand. I'm just saying you're not safe in English.
I'm safer. Of course, I'll say the wrong thing. I've got a question. A while back, you said that in history, it was kind of puns were received either aha or ha ha. And last night, I had an episode, as I'm wont to have, because I love my puns, and some friends shared one. And it said, I've started investing in stocks, beef, chicken, and vegetable. One day I hope to be a billionaire. And the room around me sighed and groaned. And I was wondering, when did it move from aha and haha to
Well, couple things. Really, it was
and why?
you can blame the Enlightenment because there was a punning was high art in a all the smart people in the coffee houses. I won't say all, but a lot of the leading thinkers of the Enlightenment hanging out in the coffee houses were punning, and and then it's as the Enlightenment took root and this kind of attempt to rationalize everything and label and create taxonomies that kind of started pushing the unruly pun to the margins of propriety. Another factor driving that was that the coffee houses you know, were a great mixer of social classes, and the higher classes found that the lower classes were just as adept at punning as they were, and obviously if a low class person could be so witty, then it must not be so witty. So that was another factor. At this time in England, the road system the road systems were getting much better and spidering out from London, and that led to kind of an amelioration of regional accents, which had fueled punning because of the variability. So there were a lot of factors that converged, and Johnson's dictionary, he was trying to fix the meaning of words and loathed puns, because imagine you're in a garret, your advances run out on your book. It's now you're in year 5 of a 3-year advance. Year 6, year 7, year 8, year 9, you've got to hate, multiple meanings, and that dictionary was a huge leap forward in terms of adding credibility to the English language as a global language, and so all these factors kind of pushed the pun off the cliff there and into the ravine, and then the groan, of course, comes kind of post-war. The groan used to be, a much rarer thing, but kind of with the change in humor and the rise of the Woody Allens and the Lenny Bruces, you go from kind of set up punchline humor to abstraction, and it doesn't lend itself as much to that. Same thing was happening in jazz too. This kind of deconstruction and greater abstraction. So it kind of paralleled a lot of other cultural trends, and then it fell into disrepute.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I remember listening to an interview with Steve Martin about the period of the early 70s in comedy, and how he came up with the kind of arrow through the head, King Tut stuff. And his description of it was that all of the comedians were following Lenny Bruce. They were really angry and bitter. And he said, this too shall pass, and I'm going to be right there when it happens. I'm going to be silly and goofy, right? But he doesn't say, I'm going to be right there and I'm going to have double meanings and go back to the setup punchline pun, right? Like that's, that kind of Rodney Dangerfield stuff it's just off the table. How do you get into thinking about this kind of stuff for a living? What's your background that you end up writing a book about the history of this kind of wordplay?
I started out in life punning, so it goes way back. As the story goes, my mom, I was almost 3, and I was saying a few words, but not putting anything together. And my mom thought, "Oh well, Johnny's a little bit slow, but that's okay. He'll get there." And I walk into the kitchen one day, and she says, "Johnny, go put on your shoes. I don't want you walking barefoot in the kitchen." And I look up at her and I giggle and I say, "Bears go barefoot." And that was my first complete sentence. And so I obviously had an interest in it and an appreciation for it from a very young age. And, we were a big Boggle family, played a lot of word games. And my dad was a punster, and we just played with language a lot. It was fun, and I always liked writing, and then I was working at the Henry Ford Museum outside of Detroit, and I heard about this. I don't know how I heard about it, but there was a World Pun Championship. And it was pre-web, so you couldn't just Google it. But I was a former reporter, so I got on the phone, and 3 or 4 phone calls later, I'm talking to the organizer in Texas, and the championship is next week, and they had all but they'd filled their brackets, and there was 1 slot left, and he tested me, and he needed to fill that bracket, and so off I went to Texas the next week for this championship, and I can talk about that championship, but years later, my agent said, "What about a book on puns?" And I just thought, oh, I don't want to write a stupid joke book. And I said, let me see what I can find. And I started digging in. I went to the great reading room in the New York Public Library on 42nd Street, which is just will make you smarter just walking in.
Yeah.
And started reading. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. There's a lot here, and that led me to discover that it was the pun that was the catalyst for the phonetic alphabet, which enabled the rise of modern civilization. So that therefore, punsters are responsible for a lot of human progress. And that was how I got writing in that way, academically, but in a popular vein, about language. And then I went on to become a speechwriter in Washington, and this is actually a true story. I had when I was applying for the job to become a speechwriter for President Clinton, the decision memo went to him, and it was a few paragraphs long, and one of the qualifications it listed was that I had been world pun champion. And it was the only thing that he commented on in the entire decision memo. He underlined it several times and wrote good in the margins, and I got the job. And when I didn't know about that decision memo until years later, when I was down in Little Rock and I visited the Clinton Presidential Library, and I asked for the decision memo out of the archives, and the archivist retrieved it and gave me a copy, and she said, "But what you need to note here is look at the underline and the comment." And I looked at it, and she said, "It's in pencil." And I said, "Pencil?" Because he always used Sharpies, like a thick Sharpies, to mark up speeches. He liked Sharpies. She said, "It was pencil because he was doing a crossword puzzle at the time, probably. And he just, would pause to do paperwork. And there was the decision memo." And I thought, God, if he hadn't been doing a crossword puzzle at that time, I might never have gotten the job. But of course, crossword puzzles are so dependent on double meanings that worked, and the universe favored me that day in number 2 pencil.
Your world championship also for you was kind of fluky. I mean, this was the first time you competed and rose to the challenge.
I did rise to the challenge. I did get lucky. I think it was the way it's the structure is slightly different now. It's evolved at the O. Henry Champion pun-off. But at the time, it was just a straight bracket. You're paired with an opponent. There's a judge and a timekeeper. They pick a topic. You've got 5 seconds to make a pun on that topic. And then your opponent has 5 seconds. It goes back and forth at 5-second intervals. And the first round, I'm paired against a former champion. And I'm like, oh, I'm gonna lose this one. And they pick the topic, and it's air vehicles. And he says, he makes a pun, and I practically didn't hear it because I was so nervous. And I said, well, I hope I picked the right flying machine. This was when I was working at the Henry Ford Museum, and I could picture a replica of the Wright flying machine hanging in the rafters at the museum. And the judge says, son, you got to make a pun. And because this is Texas. And I said, WRIGHT, I hope I picked the right flying machine. And the crowd roars, and we're off, and we're off. And it goes, he goes, I'm going to be 52 next week, so I'm never going to see 47 again. And I look out at the audience and say, I hope I find a liberator out there. And it goes back and forth on all these parts of planes. And he says, oh, you're just up here winging it. And I look at him and I say, you too? Ooh. And I will never make a better pun in my life. Perfect economy of sound and meaning, nothing superfluous, no stretch, just pure knockout blow. And he didn't go down, of course. And anyways, it went the full 7 minutes. They put it to audience vote, and I managed to advance. And in the end, I ended up beating a paramedic on external body parts. But the secret to my success was not that I was the most brilliant punster of the day, although I made some good ones. It's because I stooped to very bad puns out of sheer
They're memorable.
desperation. Just because I was so desperate and determined not to lose, and that allowed me to survive a few precarious moments. And go on to victory.
So there is at least one other famous Washington punster who competed in the World Pun-Off, although a bit later than you, and that's Alexandra Petri, who I believe has also wrote books about puns, although not in a scholarly vein. I'm curious whether there is any kind of community of Washington people.
You want to join it?
No, I actually can't do puns. I'm not good at that. Is there a community of like people who do punning and other kind of wit in Washington policy and letters circles?
There may well be. I have a DC phone number from my years there, but I'm actually in Ann Arbor after many years in New York. So I'm not as connected as I was when I lived and worked there many years ago. There are, big punning communities. When I was living in Brooklyn, now pre-pandemic. There was a monthly, maybe it was weekly. I can't remember. It was either monthly or weekly, a pun off. And I would go to it, and there would be, and I never went to compete. I went as a color commentator, and it was so impressive. I mean, there were hundreds of people drinking and punning, and I just thought, oh, this is where all the excess brain power of Brooklyn goes on a Tuesday night in the rain. And it was just like this you really felt like you were at a moment in history of intellect in Brooklyn, at the apex of Brooklyn. All these smart people just stretching the language and playing with it. And it was sort of like the coffee house of England's day, of those 17th century coffee houses in London, where smart people were playing with ideas and language. And so, yeah, yes, that's a long answer to your question. There are communities, and then there are text chains that I don't know if you have with your friends, that somebody will make a pun and it'll go back and forth. I will say this about punning. There are people who decry puns and punning, and they tend to be people who like order, and are less comfortable with disorder. And puns are messy. Language is messy, and you have to be comfortable with that ambiguity, and that the sausage making.
Can I ask a dumb question about that?
There are no dumb questions.
Other than thinking that puns are, a cheap form of wit, what is the case against puns from the Order Muppets of the world?
I love that, the Order Muppets.
I don't, like, if people find something amusing, like, I'm just not sure I understand what the source of the disapproval is.
I would say it's a couple. One is that it's not serious. You can't be serious if you're making puns. So that's people who take themselves seriously don't like puns. Two, puns can be disruptive. Sometimes that disruption, I might argue, is positive. It either helps people see things a new way, or lightens the mood, or but puns are determined by the marketplace. They're determined by the marketplace of ideas and the commercial marketplace. And if you look at graphic design, there are puns everywhere. Think of the FedEx truck. Okay, between the E and the X, there's an arrow. It's very subliminal, but it says, "Hey, we're going places." Can you picture the FedEx logo? There's an arrow. If you look at
It's interesting. I can picture the FedEx logo, but I can't see an arrow in it, which means that the subliminal aspect is working real well on
yeah,
me.
it works really well. And then look at
It's in between. It's the space in between.
It's in the space in between, which is the essence of punning, which is the space in between. If you take a bag of Tostitos, chips, corn chips, tortilla chips, I should say. And the T's are people holding out a chip over a bowl of salsa, and the bowl of salsa is the dot on the I between the two T's, Tostitos. And once you start looking, or you think about Google, they do visual puns with their O's all the time. If it's Christmas, there's two wreaths. If it's the Olympics, they do the Olympic rings. And so the human capacity for seeing multiple meanings is really key to our survival, because is that a crocodile there submerged at the watering hole, or is that a log? Well, if you're good at seeing double meanings, maybe you avoid the crocodile and don't get eaten and you propagate the species. And if you're not good at seeing double meanings or potential double meanings, you get eaten by the crocodile and you don't reproduce. So this kind of search for the meaning behind something is a very powerful ability, and this is the instinct to make analogies, to see analogies, to make puns, to hear puns, sometimes when they're not even intended. That can be a big leg up in the world. Yeah, see, there we go with it. Thank you for putting that up. There's that arrow there. And that's
so I am humiliated to admit that with the FedEx logo in front of me, I still cannot see an arrow.
Okay. It's in between the E and the X.
The big red E and the big, well, I guess orange.
Now I see
negative space. I forgot the word. Jeff put it in the chat. It's the negative space in between the letters that creates it.
So I wouldn't have noticed that in 1,000 years without it being pointed out to me staring at it.
And now you'll see it forevermore.
Interesting. All right. Well, now I know why I can't do crossword puzzles.
You can't do crossword puzzles?
No, I really can't.
I'm not good at crosswords either.
My ability to do wordplay is um, almost entirely oral and written. Once you get visual in any way, I become completely incompetent.
Well,
I,
what you
I'm good at talking
so
and I'm good at writing, but anything that involves visualizing something, I have trouble with.
So you were talking about Genesis a little bit ago, the layered meanings of Genesis, and the flood myth in Genesis is actually based on the Babylonian flood myth.
The Gilgamesh
Yeah,
epic.
and that actually turned on some puns where one of the gods were about to bring destruction, or some gods were about to bring the great flood down on earth and wash it clean, and one god talked to his supporter and said, build a boat, get everything on board the boat, and save life. And he said, well, essentially, I'm paraphrasing because I don't actually speak the original language, but he's like, what am I going to tell the neighbors? And the God says, tell them it's going to rain kibtu and cuckoo, which sounds like corn and the sound of corn being ground or something like that. It was an allusion to bounty, but it also meant death and destruction based on the pun, and those who got history's first corny pun
Oh,
survived.
excellent. Um, all right. We have 7 minutes to go, and I want your favorite puns in all of literature.
You know what? I am the wrong person to ask for that because I leave that to the province of more literary people than myself. The only thing I would add is that on that is that Shakespeare, of course, is full of puns.
Great punster.
Yeah, and that it's estimated that half of them have been lost to history because of the migration of meaning, away from certain words and the changes in pronunciation. But I will say that he
Ask for me tomorrow, and you'll find me a grave man.
yes, there we go. That's an excellent example, and one of the reasons that uh, Shakespeare was such a punster was not only because it was in vogue as a style, but they had to avoid the royal censors, and so they addressed topics of relative political issues of the day through puns, so that there was plausible deniability, just as in China there's plausible deniability when you use puns, or in a lot of cultures around the world, that use puns, because of the 6,000 plus languages in the world, probably be like 5,998 by the end of today, but all, punning spans so many different languages and language families, from Pitjantjatjara in the Australian outback to Tzotzil in the Chiapas highlands, all the Romance languages, Japanese. That it's fair to surmise that punning exists to one degree or another in just about every language
I mean, it
on Earth.
has to exist, right?
It has to exist.
Because things things can carry any way that you can represent an idea, whether it's an image or a word can carry multiple meanings because ideas in fact overlap.
Yes, and this is an important conclusion that I came to in writing this book, is that the pun is essentially history's first hyperlink. It's something that lets you leap from one topic to something wildly disparate, and land in an entirely new pool of ideas, and that is what drives human progress. Is that how do we go from banging rocks together to start a fire in a cave to orbiting the Earth in a space station. Well, every step of the way, it was people testing out combinations of previous ideas to arrive at a new one, a new way of doing something, a new way of seeing things. And without this kind of innate, I would argue, innate capacity and drive to make these hyperlinks between ideas, yeah, we'd still be living in caves, and that wouldn't be very fun.
Alicia, what's your favorite pun in literature?
Don't think I have a favorite pun in literature. Do you have one? This is a question you asked. You must have one.
Mm, I mean, I am into uh, um, the line when um, uh, uh, Mercutio is stabbed and he's asked how his wound is, and he says, "It is not so deep as a well, nor as wide as a church door, but 'tis enough 'twill serve. Ask for me tomorrow, and you'll find me a grave man." And I've always thought that was like, I would like to have the presence of mind to tell a joke that bad when I've been stabbed to death.
Well, just take solace in the fact that Shakespeare probably spent at least, 5 minutes writing that.
Yeah, maybe less. No, I have a lot. I think there's I think the presence of mind to tell bad jokes is a good thing. And I admire it very much. And so I like it when in literature somebody stares in the face of the abyss and comes up with um, uh, a flip thing to say.
So let me leave you with an image, and that is, and this is perhaps one of my favorite puns in art, which is full of them, and that is Picasso's bullhead. And if you look at that piece, it's a handlebars of a bicycle and the bicycle seat as the skull, and it is so representative of the ancient cave art of Spain and southern France, but rendered in a modern, in a more modern context, but in a very primal, simple way, and 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 it's that capacity to play with ideas, whether they're visual or written or spoken or conceptual, uh, that gives us so much potential as people, for better or worse.
Well, I will end with John told a story about his punning as a toddler. I would like to end this episode with a story about my own childhood history of puns, um, which is none so clever as John's, which is why he wrote a book about puns and I didn't. So when I was a small child, I learned about acronyms, and shortly thereafter, I was the subject of puns came up, and I asked my mother what a pun was, and she explained, as one does always, that a pun is a play on words. And for some reason, because acronyms were on my mind, I I took a visual image of the word pun as play on words. Now, of course, if you actually do the acronym, that would be POW. But I assumed that pun was just an acronym for play on words. And that stuck in my head for 10 years. And it wasn't until my late teens when I said out loud in company that pun was an acronym for play on words, and everybody stared at me like I had three heads. And I actually did the math and said play un nerds. that I realized that pun was not, in fact, an acronym. And that is why I am not good at crossword puzzles. We are going to leave it there on this Vishivanka Day 2025. John Pollack, what a pleasure it has been. My apologies again. Let's do it again soon. Folks, we're going to be back tomorrow. I have no idea who the guest is going to be. Maybe I would if I looked at Alicia's schedule. No, I actually have looked at Alicia's schedule, and there's nobody scheduled for tomorrow. And I have no idea who the co-host is going to be. And so, but I know that I'll be there, and I suspect that you'll be there, and I'll see you then.